Good day, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, The Coldest Murder. It is a podcast involving the murder of a 9-year-old girl in Bristol Borough in 1962, which has been a cold case for many years. My name is Mike Missinelli. My partner up in New York City is Vince Mola. And Vince, in this podcast, we're going to explore one of the suspects a little more in detail. We've already gone through many elements of the priest, who a lot of people think was the murderer. We're talking about Savadish. But now let's turn our attention to another one of the major suspects. As you know, from the beginning of this podcast, we started out with four suspects. We ruled one out who had a driver's test and was said to be in Virginia at the time. So the three suspects that we have left are Edward Sabatish, the priest from St. Mark's Church, where Carol Ann was murdered, Frank Zucchero, an aging drunken handyman around town, and William Schrader. Now, not much is known about William Schrader. What we know about William Schrader is that he somehow got to Bristol Borough. We don't know, and not many people know. He was kind of a drifter, and at the time was 24 years old. Now, whether he got to Bristol Borough because he had a friend down here and he was seeking out work, he did work in a factory, the Croydon Tool Company, which is on the outskirts of Bristol Borough. Um, he came to Bristol having previously had some prison time in Wilkes-Barre. Uh, he had served some time for firing a gun and had an attempted murder charge in Wilkes-Barre, PA. That must have happened when he was over 18, and certainly before he got to Bristol at age 24. We don't know how much time he served, but he did have a police record when he came to Bristol. He was also spotted that day at outside St. Mark's Church at 4:30 p.m. Now, what we know about William Schrader is that he lied to police investigators. He said it wasn't him. It couldn't have been him. He could not have been the murderer because he was actually at work at the time, saying he was at the Croydon Tool Factory. But when police checked that he had checked out of the Croydon Tool Company at 1:30 that day, which gave him ample time at 4:30 to commit a murder. And also along those lines, his residence was Lincoln Avenue, which is the street that borders St. Mark Church. So he lived in that area, was spotted outside the church. The investigation went nowhere with William Schrader. He said he wasn't there. They couldn't match his time. They had circumstantial evidence, basically. Apparently, it was not enough to arrest him. Somebody had seen him outside the church. They really couldn't prove that. Somebody he said he had lied about where he was at work. That was another circumstantial evidence that may have indicated guilt. When he was confronted with the evidence that he had not been at work, he then changed his story, and he said that he had been installing a motor in his car at a place called Gross's Junkyard, which is kind of on the outskirts of Bristol. There was a slaughterhouse there at the time. There was a bunch of industrial type of buildings there, and there was a junkyard. He said he was there on October 22nd, the day of the murder, and then he finished the job on October 23rd. A state trooper checked with James Gross, who was the owner of the junkyard, who could not recall if he had seen Schrader at the junkyard that day. So again, there's all these little loose ends, but not enough to put together to arrest William Schrader for the murder of Carol Ann Dockert. Now, the story goes because he then leaves Bristol subsequently. I don't know the exact time frame, but he leaves Bristol and relocates in a place called Houma, Louisiana, where the story picks up. In 1970, at 10 o'clock, on an October day, believe it or not, October 31st, 1970, there was a fire that burned down a rented mobile home that William Schrader was living in. In the mobile home was his wife, Audrey, her daughter from a previous marriage, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's friend, Catherine Smith. Catherine Smith died in the fire. Daughter Elizabeth suffered permanent brain damage. Audrey, the wife, survived. They could not pin anything on William Schrader at the time. It went down as some kind of a electrical fire of some sort, and they really had not connected the dots on whether this was something that he had done. However, years later, um, in 1985, detectives received information that had been that the fire had been deliberately started by William Schrader, which is really where the story picks up. Um, this went to the Supreme Court of Louisiana on appeal. He denied any involvement in the fire, and the information that they had was from a couple of witnesses down the road, 15 years down the road. There was a witness named Harold Foyet, or Foyet, Foret. He testified that on Halloween, he had heard Schrader tell his wife, quote, that he was going to burn the house down. They apparently had had some domestic problems. And then there was another witness named Judy Smith Griffith. She was the victim's sister, the unfortunate little girl who perished in the fire. She testified at a family gathering at her mother's home on Halloween night in 1970, when she was 13 years old, that she overheard Schrader tell his wife that if she be there at the house when he gets there, he's going to set it on fire. It goes on. There was another witness that was presented. His name was Teddy Lee Mahern, a classic Louisiana name. Teddy Lee said that around 7:30 or 8 o'clock on the night of the fire, October 31st, 1970, Schrader had come to the gas station where Mahern worked and pumped some gas into a small can, telling the man that he needed the gas to fix his lawnmower. Mahern said this came around mid-October 1970, and he claimed to have observed the smoke coming from Schrader's home that evening. So earlier in the evening, he bought the gas. Later, the man who sold him the gas sees smoke coming from the home that evening. The gas station was situated approximately a quarter-mile away. Mahern, the gas station worker, testified that he had known Schrader for about a year before that incident, that Schrader occasionally traded at the gas station, and that he was disliked by the proprietor and the owner. He also claimed to remember the general type of car that Schrader had driven to the gas station that evening. Okay, so based on that information, William Schrader was convicted of the crime. Now, the crime originally was a felony murder by aggravated arson. Now, there wasn't in Louisiana at that time degrees of murder, murder one, murder two, whatever. So this charge he would have stood for murder one. It was argued, and he was represented by a public defender. He was an indigent guy, kind of a loser. He was he was told that we can now convict you for manslaughter, which he was convicted. Now, just to shed some more light on the case, Vince, they had the state had called two expert witnesses in this case, Harold Myers and Jimmy Barnhill. They did not examine the site of the fire until 8 years after, in 1978, and then in 1985. And they testified that the condition of the house was the same when Myers and Barnhill examined the site immediately after the fire, where they said it was an electrical fire. So the state's expert said it was an electrical fire, but the defense presented the testimony of a man who was the city fire inspector, and he said that the cause of the fire could not be determined, and he refuted the state's two expert witnesses who had said that this did not indicate the presence of flammable gases or liquid. The problem with this case is the house burns down in 1970, and you're not looking at this until down the road. So if you're a lawyer, there are plenty of reasons to poke holes in this kind of a theory. Your thoughts so far on this?
One of the things that keeps jumping out at me, the more we learn and talk about Schrader, is he's as much as a kind of this miscreant, rapscallion loser, he's a slippery sucker, and he's got a cool hand to himself. What we keep learning about him over and over again, no matter how much pressure is put on him, he knows when it's time to shut his mouth.
Sorry for my dog barking, and my dog disturbed by the details of this particular case. Now, the case was fascinating. I read over this case that sent William Schrader to prison in Louisiana for a term of 21 years. There was an expert that was called named Ulysses Gidry. Gidry is a classic Louisiana name. In fact, since I am involved in sports, there was a pitcher for the Yankees way back in the day, well, in the 70s, I guess, named Ron Gidry, and he was called Louisiana Lightning. I don't know if there's any relation, but it seems awful like a coincidence that a Gidry was involved in this. But he testified that the wiring in the house was inadequate for a typical residence now with all the household appliances, that if large appliances and the air conditioning unit or electric heat was put on, it would be dangerous and would cause some fire, could possibly cause a fire. So how he was convicted was interesting. You convict a lot of these kind of criminal cases based on demeanor. I am quite positive that William Schrader did not come off well in court in front of a jury. So he was convicted. Now, he is serving time in Louisiana. Carol Ann Doherty crime occurs in 1962. He goes to Louisiana in 1970. This fire happens. He is not convicted until 1985 in Louisiana. So he is in the Elaine Hunt Correctional Facility. I tracked him there, and I found out his incarceration and when he was extradited to Bristol. Because here's what happened. The case that with the suspects in the Carol Ann Doherty murder, the priest obviously is a main suspect. Zucchero is probably a main suspect, but not as much as the priest. And now here comes Schrader. The Bucks County DA's office somehow got involved in this case and snatched it away from the Bristol Borough Police Department. In fact, what had happened was the Bristol Police Department in 1992 started to reinvestigate this case based on some information they had gotten and based on some newspaper accounts that it was the 30-year anniversary of this heinous crime in Bristol Borough, which had gone unsolved. The police chief at the time, Frank Parento, had assigned a detective to look further into this to see if they could make any more inroads into this. They had interviewed the priest. They were unable to interview Schrader, who was in jail. He was a suspect at the time. He had now moved out of the area. He was in jail serving a manslaughter sentence in Houma, Louisiana, the Elaine Hunt Correctional Facility. But the state police, it's incredible when I think about it, was working behind the back of the Bristol Borough Police Department. And so they made arrangements to extradite William Schrader from jail in Houma, Louisiana. They brought him up to Bristol, unbeknownst to the Bristol Police Department. They apparently drove him around Bristol once they got him up here to see if he would maybe have a pang of consciousness or guilt, drove him past St. Mark's Church where the murder was committed, and hoping that he would somehow confess to the crime. This is the shot in the dark that they took with this guy. So the Bristol police found out about it. They raised holy hell about it, but the higher authority prevailed here. The DA's detectives prevailed. They effectively snatched the case away from the Bristol police, who had by then made arrangements with the forensic society called the Vidocq Society, who was prepared to come in and help them investigate the case and use their forensic abilities to try to solve the case. I'm speechless at this whole thing that law enforcement people in this particular case did not work together, but worked against each other. Vince.
You know, as you're saying this, the immediate thought is hand in glove. They should be working in lockstep with one another. They serve the same community, essentially. And to undermine the Bristol Police Department, it doesn't make sense until you think of the players involved. And Alan Rubenstein was a classic glory grabber. And so on that level, it's not surprising.
Okay, so we have a suspect being extradited from jail in Louisiana, brought back to Bristol. I am told that the Bristol police did not know until a woman showed up at the police department door, knocking at the door, asking where her brother was. Police officers say, "Well, who is your brother?" And she says, "William Schrader. He's been brought up here and I want to see him. And I assume you have custody of him." Bristol Borough Police did not have custody of him. The DA's office detectives had custody of him. So they then decide to convene the grand jury, where they call Sabatish, they call Schrader. Schrader, who did not say a peep when he's being driven around Bristol, also did not say a peep in front of the grand jury. In fact, he took the Fifth Amendment on the grounds it may incriminate me for every question they asked him. Now, we have a priest who did not do that. He just flat out said he didn't do it. Now, I should also say that both of these suspects, way back in 1962, passed the lie detector test, including Schrader. So the priest talks in front of the grand jury, not enough to indict him. Schrader takes the Fifth Amendment, which normally would indicate, well, if you're taking the Fifth Amendment, you must be hiding something. You must be guilty. But again, when you put all the evidence together, we find it incredulous that you could have him spotted outside the church. You could have him lying about an alibi. You can have him with a police record as he came into town, and then he was convicted for manslaughter in Louisiana, and they still could not have enough, even circumstantial evidence, to arrest him. And when they put him in front of the grand jury and he takes the fifth, it's over. If you can't you can't get an indictment. There's no other choice for you but to dismiss the guy. Maybe he decides to hang around again and commit another crime, and at that point, maybe you have some kind of a basis for interviewing him where he can admit to the previous crime. But at this point, the only alternative is you send him back to Louisiana prison, which is what happened. After the grand jury, he took the fifth, no indictment in the case. The case goes stone cold again. They return Schrader to Louisiana. He gets back there on March 31st, 1993. He was extradited on March 5th to come up to Bristol. Where they housed him, I don't know. And I have no details about William Schrader's prison record because they didn't have any records about his time in prison, good behavior, whatever it was. So he is extradited on March 5th, 1993 to Bristol. He somehow spends some time here in Bristol and then is returned on the 31st. So he spent 26 days in this area in Bristol. I don't know whether they held him thinking they can interrogate him every day and that he would eventually admit to the crime. But once they put him in front of the grand jury and he took the fifth, it's over. He goes back to prison. Again, we're talking about him being sentenced in 1986 for a 21-year sentence for manslaughter based on the death of this poor young girl in a burned down trailer home. His stepdaughter being brain damaged, his wife still being alive, but I have no idea what happened to that point after that point because he's in jail and I assume the wife is gone or whatever. He gets released from prison on April 8th, 1993. So he got returned 8 days later. He was released from prison after serving only 7 years of a 21-year sentence. Now, what do you make of that?
It stinks. It's the amount of backhand under the table deal making that was going on, I reckon, between both groups of people from Rubenstein's folks and the folks in Louisiana and whatever little deals that they were making. And then again, I think Schrader was clever and knew that he could probably pit one against the other, knowing how desperate the folks in Bucks County were to get a resolution to this, and he leveraged that. And this guy wasn't educated, but I think at some level he was devious and clever enough to figure out if I pit these two against each other and I keep my mouth shut, maybe I'll be able to find my way out of it.
He was a criminal con man. So now we're talking about a man who was probably disposed to a criminal element. So let's look at what we have here. There are two people that are suspects here that have criminal disposition. One is the priest. Now, the criminal intent or the criminal element of both these gentlemen are different. The priest had a criminal element. There's no question about it. He was molesting young children. He was a kind of a slimy guy who didn't have a conscience and was involved in all kinds of heinous things like buying lingerie and covering his holiness as a priest with all these perversions. Different kind of criminal element. This guy had a true criminal element. He came to Bristol with a criminal record. He had handled a gun. It was an attempted murder charge. He's 24 years old. He's kind of a drifter. He took a job in a factory. He lived around the corner from the church. So now I don't know if we're more confused or not. We've gotten now into the life of William Schrader after we got into the life of the priest Sabatish. And most people that are listening to this podcast had already made up their mind about Sabatish. There's also that little twist of the murder in Hazleton. So we're trying to get to the truth. And sometimes it's very difficult to get to the truth. And all we can do is present the information that we have. We presented tremendous amount of information on the priest. And today we have now presented some information on a man who was convicted of manslaughter, who had the disposition to burn down a mobile home and kill a young girl and maim another young girl.
Mike, and I also think it's important. I'm glad that you mentioned our suspects again, because we rule out our youngest guy. Then the town drunk confesses, right? But he doesn't seem like he has the wherewithal, physically or mentally, to pull this off. But Schrader is a 24-year-old when this happens, and he works physical jobs. So I would say he probably had the physical wherewithal to commit a crime like the one committed against Carol Ann, because that took somebody who had a physical prowess to pull that off. That was not an easy one to do.
I have attempted to get in touch with the public defender that represented him, and for some reason I'm unable to find him. I found another public defender who said that he did not represent William Schrader. I don't know if an attorney who had actually represented him in this manslaughter case could reveal, because of attorney-client privilege, which doesn't even go away when the client dies. I was hoping that I could get in touch with the public defender who would tell me, you know what, he confessed to that murder. But since we don't have that, all we have are speculation based on details that we know about these people. So to review, Sabatish the priest, predisposed to molesting young girls. When the murder happened, could not look the family in the eye. Took a confession, walked out of the confession when Carol Ann's father tried to ask whether a priest could have committed this crime. And then we get to Frank Zucchero. Now, the thing of Frank Zucchero, even though he was a drunken handyman, Frank Zucchero had given details to the police with the hip bruise, where he said he chased Carol Ann around the church and she had bumped into a pew. And that's when he had grabbed her and chased her up the stairs of the landing. And that's where he committed the murder. But we looked at that and said, well, maybe that was coerced, because a police officer did admit to really trying to coerce a confession out of him. But the other element of Frank Zucchero is the folding of the sock that was stuffed in Carol Ann's mouth. It was folded in a certain way. When the police looked at Zucchero's bedroom, he had his socks folded exactly the same way. And now we get to William Schrader, a criminal element who came into town and left town and wound up committing an even worse crime, a crime of manslaughter, where he burned down a mobile home and killed someone, and was brought back and extradited and put in front of a grand jury. This case just whirs around in my brain as it whirs around in your brain and everybody else who listens to this podcast, because everybody's trying to figure out who was this that did that. And this is what we're trying to shed some light on, to the point where we can get investigators to do these sophisticated DNA tests to once and for all figure out who did this and put this to rest once and for all. Because a cold case going on for 62 years, lingers in your heart, and the people that grew up in that town and the people in Bucks County who know about this case. And when we think about it today, we go, my God, this case would have been solved today. How could it not be solved now?
It's I think the other part that's confounding and creates pain is that not only did the police lack some of the sophistication necessary to do this using DNA, but I think also knowing that there were all these external forces that were operating against one another instead of with one another to get to a resolution.
Okay. In our next podcast, we are going to talk to the Bristol police chief in 1992. His name was Frank Parento. When this case got hot again, it was being reinvestigated by the Bristol police, and thanks to the journalist J.D. Mullane, who we've had on an earlier podcast, the topic had come up again, and it ignited more investigation. We're going to talk to Frank Parento to see how he would explain how this case unraveled away from the Bristol police. There was a detective that was assigned by Chief Parento to look back into this case, and they thought that they had some DNA and new DNA techniques would work. The case was unexpectedly snatched away from the Bristol police by the Bucks County DA's office. In our next episode, we'll talk to Frank Parento on why that happened and how it happened. Thanks for listening, everybody. This has been podcast number 5 of The Coldest Murder. For Vince Mola in New York City, I am Mike Missinelli. Thanks for listening to it, and we hope you're enjoying it and intrigued by this. And just come along with us for this ride. We hope to do 9 podcasts, and by the 9th podcast, we'll have more of an idea on how this case can be solved. Thank you, everybody. Good night.